The morning her father died, Vera Whitfield did not cry. She stood at the kitchen window of the farmhouse while the county coroner's vehicle rolled slowly down the gravel lane, its red taillights blurring in the pre-dawn dark like two embers being carried away by wind. The fields beyond the window were invisible, swallowed whole by the March blackness, but she knew them by heart, the way a person knows the walls of a room they've slept in for 24 years. She knew the low rise where the soil turned from sandy loam to rich black clay. She knew the fence line where the old cottonwood had split in the ice storm of 1961 and never fully healed. She knew the smell of that land when it was wet, something between iron and bread, something that did not have a word in any language she'd been taught. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and felt the vibration of the coroner's engine fade through the pane until there was nothing left but silence. Her father, Thomas Whitfield, had been 57 years old. He had gone to bed at 9 o'clock the previous evening, as he always did, removed his boots in the mudroom, as he always did, set his watch on the nightstand, as he always did, and sometime between then and the first gray light of morning, his heart had simply stopped. No warning, no struggle. The bedroom door had been open, the sheets barely disturbed, as though he had only been resting, as though he might rise any moment. Vera had found him herself. She did not think about that now. She turned from the window, pulled her father's flannel work shirt tighter across her shoulders. She'd taken it from the peg by the back door, without thinking, reached for it, the way she'd reached for it 100 times as a girl, and walked to the kitchen table. On the table sat a plain white envelope. The county attorney had delivered it the afternoon following the funeral, along with a manila folder containing the deed to the property, the title to the 2 pickup trucks, and a short list of accounts at the Granger County Savings Bank. The envelope was sealed. Her name was written on the front in her father's careful, square handwriting. Below her name, he'd written 4 words, "When you need it." She had not opened it. That restraint cost her something. It sat on the table through the visitation, through the funeral, through the casseroles and the handshakes, and the neighbors filing through the farmhouse saying things people say when they do not know what to say. It sat there while the Dunbar family from the adjacent property brought a ham. It sat there while Aldous Dunbar himself stood in the living room with his hat in both hands and told her that if she needed anything, anything at all, she should not hesitate. His wife, a broad, practical woman named Ruth, had gripped Vera's hand and said nothing, which was the most honest thing anyone offered that week. The envelope sat there through all of it. On the 4th morning after the funeral, before dawn, before she'd made coffee, Vera sat down at the kitchen table, picked up the envelope, and opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. Not her father's handwriting this time. The script was older, more deliberate. The ink slightly faded to the color of old rust. She recognized it immediately. It was her grandfather Eli's hand. She had grown up watching that hand move across the pages of his journals, across grain ledgers, across letters to the county extension office. She would have recognized it anywhere. The note was dated April 14th, 1951, more than 2 decades before this morning. More than 2 decades before Vera had been born. To whoever stands in this kitchen after Thomas cannot, it began. You will be tired. You will be afraid, though you will not call it that. You will hear many voices telling you what the land requires. Listen to the land first. Listen to the numbers second. Listen to everyone else last, if at all. The ground does not lie. The numbers do not lie. Men with something to sell almost always do. There is a journal in the attic, the one with the brown cover and the brass clasp. Read it before you make any decision. Do not sign anything until you have. I love you, though I may never know your name. Eli Whitfield. Vera read the letter twice. Then she folded it along its original crease, replaced it in the envelope, and set it at the center of the table. She sat with it for a long time, the farmhouse utterly still around her, the fields outside beginning to emerge from darkness as the eastern sky shifted from black to the pale wash gray of early Kansas spring. Then she pushed back her chair, climbed the narrow staircase to the 2nd floor, pulled down the attic hatch, and went up. The attic smelled of cedar and dust and old paper, the particular smell of things that have not been disturbed in a long time. Vera swept her flashlight across the low space across cardboard boxes and a broken rocking chair and two steamer trunks. She found the journal on the third shelf of an open wooden bookcase, exactly where her grandfather had said it would be, as though he had placed it there knowing she would come. Brown cover, brass clasp. She lifted it carefully with both hands. She brought it downstairs, made coffee, and began to read. Eli Whitfield had started the journal in 1938, the year the last of the Dust Bowl years broke across the high plains like a biblical punishment. He had been 26 years old, newly married working land that his own father had claimed under the Homestead Act. The first entries were spare and practical rainfall total seed cost the price per bushel at the co-op elevator in Granger. But by 1942, the entries had expanded, grown richer, as though the war years had taught Eli that a man's observations were worth recording in full. He wrote about his horses. He wrote about the economics of horse-drawn cultivation in terms that were not sentimental, but precise, the way an engineer might write about a system he trusted. A horse converts grass into work, one entry read. Grass grows from this ground. Therefore, a horse converts this ground into work. A tractor converts petroleum into work. Petroleum comes from somewhere else entirely. A man who powers his farm from what his farm grows controls his own supply chain. A man who requires delivery of fuel from 1,000 miles away is not a farmer. He is a customer. Vera read that entry 3 times. She set her coffee down. She read for 2 hours without stopping. By the time the March sun had climbed fully above the horizon and was laying its pale light across the kitchen floor, she had reached 1953, where Eli had recorded the departure of his last working horses, sold finally to a breeder in the western part of the state, after Vera's father had argued with the confidence of a young man who had read the agricultural reports and believed them that mechanization was not optional. The entry for that day was only 2 sentences long. Thomas says the horses are finished. I believe Thomas will learn what I have learned, but I hope the lesson is not too expensive. Vera closed the journal. She sat still for a moment. Then she opened the manila folder the county attorney had left and removed the papers detailing her father's accounts. What she found there required her to sit with it longer than she had expected. Thomas Whitfield had not died leaving his daughter a debt-burdened farm. He had died leaving her a clean one. But the cleanliness had a cost she had not known about. 5 years prior, in 1968, her father had sold the eastern 200 acres of the original Whitfield parcel, the bottom land, the richest soil on the property, to cover the final payments on a combine that had since broken down beyond repair. Vera had been 19 at the time, away at school for a single semester before coming home, and her father had not mentioned the sale. The transaction was recorded in the county clerk's documents with the straightforward neutrality of bureaucratic fact. Conveyance of 200 acres, Whitfield parcel east to Harold Beckett. Consideration $18,000, recorded October 3, 1968. The tractor that purchase had paid off was currently rusting in the north shed. The farm Vera had inherited was 800 acres, not the 1,000 she'd believed. It was free of debt, entirely, genuinely free, which was rarer in Granger County than most people understood, but it was smaller than the family had always represented it to be, and it was without any working mechanical equipment capable of bringing in a harvest. Her father's old pickup ran. The well pump ran. Everything else in the machine shed was either broken, outdated, or both. She sat with that information until it settled into something she could work with, rather than something that paralyzed her. Her grandfather had lost 200 acres to the logic of mechanization, paid for the privilege of that loss, and left her a journal explaining exactly why it had happened. The inheritance was not just land and silence. It was a completed argument documented over 30 years, waiting for someone who would read it. Vera got up, washed her coffee cup, and drove into Granger. The Harmon Agricultural Supply dealership occupied the largest commercial building on the county road east of town, a structure of glass and corrugated steel that seemed to announce its own importance. The showroom floor waxed to a mirror finish. The machines arrayed inside like monuments to a particular idea about what farming should look like. Cresswell Harmon had built the business over 15 years into the dominant equipment dealer in a 4-county region, and the dealership carried that dominance in every detail, from the chrome lettering above the entrance to the quality of the coffee perpetually brewing in the sales office. Vera had been there twice before, both times with her father. She remembered the smell of the place, machine oil, and industrial cleaner, and something synthetic she could never identify as different from every other smell in her daily life. The smell of a world that had decided dirt was something to be processed rather than respected. Harmon himself came out of his office as the bell above the front door announced her arrival. He was a large man, comfortably prosperous, with a salesman's instinct for reading a room that expressed itself as warmth even when it was calculation. He had a wide, easy smile that he deployed without appearing to deploy it the way practiced men do, and he extended his hand before she'd taken 3 steps inside. Vera Whitfield. His voice carried genuine-sounding sympathy. Your father was a fine man. We'll all feel that loss. She thanked him simply and let him lead her back toward the office past the service bay, where 2 mechanics were working on a disassembled tractor, past the wall of parts catalogs and the framed photographs of satisfied customers posed beside their new equipment. The office was glass-fronted, looking out over the showroom floor, and behind Harmon's broad mahogany desk, the window framed the flagship machine of his current inventory, the Harvester 915. A thing of green and yellow steel, so large it seemed to pressurize the room simply by existing. Harmon poured 2 coffees without asking whether she wanted one, set them on the desk, and settled into his chair with the ease of a man who spent most of his waking hours in that chair, performing exactly this function. He talked for a while about the machine. He was good at it, not aggressive, not pushy, but thorough in the way of someone who believes entirely in what he is selling, or who has made peace with the difference between believing and performing belief. The Harvester 915 had an air-conditioned cab, hydrostatic drive, a 20-foot header that could take grain at a rate that made the previous generation of equipment look like hand tools. It could cut harvest time on a property like hers from weeks to days. In the current market, with grain prices where they were, that efficiency was not a luxury. He slid the photograph across the desk. Then he slid the loan application. The principal was $200,000. The repayment schedule ran across the bottom of the page in numbers that were clear enough until they weren't, until the eye moved naturally away from them toward the large, promising figure of the machine's specifications. Vera did not move her eyes away. She picked up the document and read it. She read it the way her grandfather had taught her to read anything that required a signature, which was slowly, fully from the first line to the last, without skipping the sections printed in smaller type. She read the maintenance agreement provision, which required all service work to be performed exclusively by Harmon-certified technicians at rates established by the manufacturer. She read the interest adjustment clause, which allowed the lending institution to revise the rate annually in response to Federal Reserve guidance. She read the insurance requirement, which mandated a policy level that represented a separate annual cost, not reflected in the payment schedule on the first page. When she set the document down, Harmon was watching her with an expression that had shifted slightly. Still warm, but now attentive in a new way. The way a card player becomes attentive when the hand goes differently than anticipated. I appreciate the detail, Vera told him. She kept her voice even, not confrontational, simply honest. But I want to understand something before we go further. These maintenance provisions, what does the average first-year service cost look like above the loan payment? Harmon folded his hands on the desk. It varies. The machine comes with a standard warranty that covers most first-year issues. She waited. The warranty covered parts. It did not cover labor. The labor schedule was on the document she'd read. She calculated the differential quickly and set the number beside the adjusted interest rate in her mind, running the arithmetic her grandfather had spent 30 years writing down in a brown-covered journal. The room was quiet for a moment. Through the glass wall of the office, she could hear the faint metallic sounds from the service bay. Harmon leaned forward slightly. Vera, I want to be direct with you because I think you deserve that. Every farmer in this county who intends to remain competitive is moving toward this class of equipment. The Dunbar operation signed last fall. The Jorgensens signed in February. Beckett's already running one of these on the bottomland. Sitting outside that trend is not a neutral position. It has a cost too, just a different kind. The mention of Beckett, the man who now farmed the 200 acres her father had sold, landed without expression on her face. She was aware of the precision of that choice, whether intentional or not. It named the consequence of the family's previous decision to mechanize, now turned into an argument for continuing down the same road. She asked one more question, a simple one. How many of your current customers own their equipment outright? Harmon's smile held its shape but lost something behind it, a fraction of a second's adjustment like a photograph coming slightly out of focus. Most of our customers are working with financing. Yes, that's the standard structure for capital equipment of this. All of them, or most. He unfolded his hands and placed them flat on the desk. The financing options available through our lending partners are genuinely competitive, Vera. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't. She picked up the loan application and set it back down in front of him, oriented toward him rather than toward herself. She was not angry. Anger would have been a waste. She was simply clear the way the numbers were clear when you read them, without wanting them to say something different. I'm not going to sign this, she said. I appreciate your time, and I mean that. But I won't be signing. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a room in which something expected has not happened. Harmon sat back. His expression moved through several calibrations, surprise, reassessment, a flicker of something that was not quite annoyance, but lived in the same neighborhood, before settling on a kind of firm, deliberate concern, the concern of a man who has decided that the person across from him is making a mistake and feels obligated to say so. Vera, you have 800 acres of wheat coming into growing season with no working harvest equipment. I understand grief can make the future feel. The fields had been measured, she told him. The soil was in good condition. The debt position was clean. She had read the relevant documents. She had a plan. He waited. She was going to buy horses. What followed was not immediate. There was a full held moment of silence in which the information traveled from the air between them into Harmon's comprehension and registered there with an impact that was visible in his face before he managed it. Then the sound came from the service bay doorway, where two mechanics had drifted forward during the conversation, the way people do when something unusual is happening, some gravitational draw toward spectacle. One of them made a short, low sound that was not quite a word. The other followed with something that was horses. Cresswell Harmon's voice was careful, as though he was handling something that might be more fragile than it appeared. You intend to farm 800 acres of wheat with horses. Clydesdales, Vera clarified. 12 of them. The carefulness in Harmon's voice dissolved. What replaced it was not unkind, not cruel. It was the laughter of a man who is genuinely surprised, who has spent 15 years selling machines to farmers and has never once sat across from someone proposing to go in the other direction, and whose surprise has bypassed social management entirely and come out as laughter before he could make a different choice. The mechanics in the doorway laughed too, the easy, comfortable laughter of men who know the world as a particular thing and have just seen someone propose it as something else. Vera stood. She did not hurry. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair, settled it over her shoulders, and looked at Harmon with an expression that was not hard and not soft. It was the expression of someone who has finished the conversation she came to have. Harmon's laughter subsided into something closer to genuine concern, the performative sympathy of a man who has decided the woman in front of him is acting from grief rather than judgment. Vera, he said, listen to me. The world has moved past this. Your grandfather's time was a different time. You cannot compete in the 1973 grain market with draft animals. You will lose the harvest. You will lose the farm. I've seen it happen to families that had every intention of making it work. People with more resources than my grandfather operated this property for 30 years without a dollar of bank debt, Vera told him. She was almost to the office door. She turned once briefly not to deliver a speech, but because the thing she was about to say was accurate, and she wanted it on record. He died on his own land with clear title. How many of the names on your sales board can say the same? The laughter from the service bay had already stopped before she finished the sentence. The quiet that followed her question into the room was a different quality of quiet than the one that had preceded it. Harmon's face tightened in a way that had nothing to do with sympathy. He was a man whose professional identity was constructed on the proposition that the kind of farming Clara's grandfather had practiced was dead properly and necessarily dead. And the question she'd placed in the room challenged that proposition in a way that required a response he didn't quite have ready. She walked through the showroom past the Harvester 915 with its enormous green flanks and its promise of efficient modernity and out through the front door into the cold March air. The drive home took 12 minutes. She made it in silence, the truck's heater ticking against the chill, the flat Kansas landscape unreeling on either side of the county road with its particular late winter plainness, the fields brown and stripped the sky a high pale gray that gave no indication of what it intended. By the time she turned into the farm lane, her face had settled into something that was not triumph and not defeat, but simply forward-facing. The expression of someone who has completed one step of a longer walk. She changed into work clothes and spent the rest of the afternoon in the north shed taking inventory of what was there. Two broken tractors, neither repairable without parts that would cost more than the machines were worth. A grain auger with a seized motor. A cultivator missing two of its shanks. A disc harrow that was functional but useless without a tractor to pull it. In the far back corner, under a canvas tarp so old it had stiffened into a kind of geological formation, she found what she was looking for. The binder was a 1936 McCormick Deering horse-drawn grain binder, manufactured to be pulled by a team of four. It had not been used since before her birth. She pulled the tarp back section by section and stood in the dust that rose around her, coughing, once studying the machine with a slow, methodical attention. The main drive chain was present. The canvases were rotted through and would need replacement. The bull wheel's wooden spokes had dried and cracked. The knotter mechanism, the most complex part, was seized with rust, but intact. She ran her hands over the iron frame, checking for fractures, for damage that would be irreparable. She found none. She covered it again and walked back to the farmhouse. That evening, she called information and asked for the number for Ernest Galloway in Comanche County. The operator came back after a pause to say the listing was for a rural road address, no telephone. Vera wrote down the route number. She opened her grandfather's journal to the page where Eli had first mentioned Galloway, 1949. A single reference drove west to see Ernest Galloway's Clydesdales. If there is still a man in Kansas who knows how to breed working horses, it is Galloway. His animals have what the books call presence, but what really means honesty. They know their work. Below the entry in pencil, added later by the slightly more cramped hand of an older man, "Tell Clara about Galloway if she ever asks." The name in the penciled note was not Vera's. It was her mother's name. Her mother had died when Vera was 3. Eli had written that note expecting it to be read by a different woman in a different decade under different circumstances. Vera sat with that for a moment. Then she closed the journal and went to bed. She was awake before 4. Aldous Dunbar came by the following morning. He was a broad man in his mid-40s with a face that weather had treated honestly, not unkindly, and he operated his farm with the methodical competence of someone who had made peace with scale. He ran 1,400 acres on the other side of the shared fence line, employed 2 full-time hands, and had signed for a Harmon machine the previous October. He was not a man who made casual visits. When he appeared at the back door, hat in hand, Vera understood that someone had talked. She made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table and accepted the cup with both hands and did not say anything immediately, which was the most honest thing about Aldous Dunbar. He did not fill silence with noise. He sat in it until he was ready. Finally, he said that he'd heard about her visit to Harmon's. He was not judgmental about it. He said it matter-of-factly, the way someone names a piece of shared information that has passed through a community. "Word gets around," Vera said. He nodded. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. He told her she could be straight with him about where things stood financially with the farm. He wouldn't repeat it. He had known her father for 20 years. She told him the position was clean, no debt. He received that with visible surprise, quickly managed. He had assumed, as most of the county had apparently assumed, that Thomas Whitfield had left behind the customary tangle of equipment loans and operating lines of credit that constituted normal farm accounting in Granger County. The news that Vera held a debt-free property with clear title produced in his expression a rapid reevaluation that he was too honest to entirely conceal. He took a sip of coffee. He said that in that case, if she wanted to consider a different approach than what Harmon was offering, he might be able to help her think through options. His brother-in-law was a farm broker who operated out of Wichita. A property in her position, clean title, 800 acres of decent ground, would move well in the current market. He'd seen smaller parcels go for better than she might expect. It would not be a distress sale. She'd come out with enough to start fresh somewhere else if that was the direction she wanted. She watched him speak. He was sincere. He was not maneuvering. He genuinely believed he was offering her a reasonable path, a dignified one, and that the alternative, whatever she'd told Harmon she intended to do, was a path toward a harder outcome. She thanked him. She meant it. She told him that she wasn't going to sell. He said that he thought she might say that. He said it without judgment, only with the mild sadness of a practical man who has watched people make choices that practical men would not make. My grandfather worked this ground for 30 years without owing the bank a dollar, she told him. She said it simply not as an argument, but as a fact she was committed to. He died on his own land. I want to do the same thing, or I want to fail trying. I don't want to fail by not trying. Aldous Dunbar was quiet for a moment. He looked at the kitchen, at the old farmhouse interior, at the journal on the table. He put his hat back on and stood up and said that he respected that, and that the offer from his brother-in-law stood open if she changed her mind, and that he hoped she knew what she was doing. She told him she was still working on that part. He smiled at that, a real smile, brief, the kind that happens before a person can decide whether to let it. He went out the back door and drove away in his truck, leaving Vera alone in the kitchen with the journal and the envelope and the morning light moving across the floor. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the particular weight of a decision that has been made but not yet proven. The difference between a plan and a delusion is time and outcome, and she was standing at the beginning of a span of time in which the difference had not yet been established. She was 24 years old. She had 800 acres, a debt-free deed, and a dead grandfather's conviction, preserved in 30 years of careful handwriting. She had a broken binder under a stiff tarp in the north shed. She had the name of a man in Comanche County who bred working horses and had no telephone. She picked up the journal, the coffee, and her keys. She had a 3-hour drive ahead of her in a Kansas spring that would not wait for certainty. The story of what Vera Whitfield said at Harmon Agricultural Supply reached the grain co-op by lunchtime. By supper, it had reached the barbershop. By the following morning, it had achieved the particular momentum of a story that people repeat, not because it requires repeating, but because the repeating itself does something for the person who tells it. It confirms a thing they believe about how the world works, about what youth is capable of understanding, about the distance between sentiment and sense. She heard versions of it secondhand over the following days. A girl buying horses. A girl who thought the county had turned itself around 50 years just because she'd read her grandfather's diary. A girl who was going to lose the cleanest inheritance in Granger County to a romantic notion and a team of animals that belonged in a museum. The stories were not vicious. They were the stories of people who were certain, which is its own particular kind of cruelty. The cruelty that does not know it is cruelty because it mistakes itself for wisdom. What those stories could not contain what they left out, because they did not have the information and would not have known how to use it if they did, was the arithmetic. Not the emotion, not the inheritance, not the grandfather's ghost preserved in ink, the arithmetic. 12 draft horses, properly managed, could cultivate and harvest 800 acres at a rate that, while slower than mechanical harvest, was adequate to the task. The input cost for 12 horses feed farrier. Veterinary maintenance was a fraction of the fuel maintenance, insurance, and debt service on a $200,000 machine. The land a horse team worked experienced less compaction, better drainage, higher earthworm activity, and improved long-term fertility compared to land worked by machines whose weight exceeded 10 tons. These were not romantic claims. They were documented in the agricultural extension literature that nobody read because the conclusion was inconvenient. Her grandfather had read it. He'd copied the relevant passages into his journal in 1948 and written beside them, "The numbers say what the salesman won't." Vera had read those passages on the morning she opened the journal before she drove to Harmon's, before Aldous Dunbar came to the kitchen table, before the story of her decision had begun its journey through the county's social circuits. She had read the numbers before any of the rest of it, because the numbers were the foundation and everything else was built on top. The laughter at Harmon's dealership was real. The concern in Aldous Dunbar's practical eyes was real. The weight of being the subject of a county's confident pity was real, and it was heavier than she had expected, heavier than logic alone could completely manage. But under all of it, solid and unmovable were the numbers. Her grandfather had given her the numbers. He had spent 30 years making sure someone would have them when the time came. She was driving west into the chalk hills before the week was out, following a route number on a piece of paper, looking for a man who bred horses in a world that had decided horses were finished, carrying a journal that documented page by documented page why that decision had been wrong. The road west out of Granger County lost its confidence gradually. The state highway became a county road. The county road became a farm-to-market strip of crumbling asphalt. The asphalt became gravel. The gravel became two tire tracks pressed into chalky soil by whatever vehicles had reason to come this way. Vera's truck handled the transition without complaint, the old engine settling into the low, steady register it maintained on long drives, the kind of mechanical patience that reminded her of the horses she hadn't yet bought. The chalk hills of Comanche County rose around her in gentle, eroded waves. Nothing dramatic, nothing that announced itself as landscape worth noticing, unless you already knew how to look at country that kept its character quiet. Ernest Galloway's property appeared at the end of a lane marked by a mailbox so weathered that the number on it was more suggestion than fact. She almost passed it. The lane ran a quarter-mile between two fence lines before opening into a yard where the buildings were arranged with the unplanned logic of a working farm that had grown by need rather than design, a long barn with a hipped roof darkened by decades of weather. Two smaller outbuildings, a farmhouse with a covered porch. Everything maintained with the particular care of someone who could not afford to replace things, so chose instead to preserve them. She had barely stepped out of the truck when he came around the corner of the barn. Ernest Galloway was taller than she'd expected from the image she'd built around her grandfather's description. He moved with the deliberate economy of a man whose body had been in conversation with hard work for 70 years. Not slow but unhurried, each movement the minimum required to accomplish the thing. His face was the landscape of Comanche County, rendered in skin-eroded honest, marked by the specific weathering that comes from spending a life mostly outdoors in a place with strong sun. He carried a length of leather harness in one hand, a rag in the other, wiping grease from a buckle he'd apparently been cleaning when she arrived. He looked at her across the yard for a moment. Then Eli Whitfield's granddaughter. I see him in the way you stand. He was not performing recognition. He stated it the way he would state a fact about weather or soil, observable, verifiable, worth noting. She told him she'd found his name in the journal. She told him the rest of it briefly without editorializing her father's death, the farm's condition, the decision she'd made, the arithmetic behind it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked past her toward the fields beyond the fence, where she could now see the horses, a dozen or more of them in the near pasture, massive, unhurried, their pale fetlocks catching the afternoon light. The herd had the quality of something permanent, something that had been in that pasture long enough to belong to it rather than simply occupy it. I kept the best ones, he said finally. I didn't know for who, I knew for when. He brought her into the pasture through the gate at the corner of the fence line. The horses registered her arrival without alarm, several lifting their heads to look before returning to the grass. Their size at close range was different from their size at distance, not just larger, but more present, more dimensional. The way a mountain is different when you're standing at its base than when you're looking at it from across a valley. She had grown up around horses, had worked with her grandfather's team as a girl, but standing among Galloway's Clydesdales was a recalibration. These animals were the product of a century of selective breeding for specific virtues: strength, temperament, intelligence, the willingness to work steadily across long days without the anxiety that made some powerful animals unreliable. They were not gentle the way small things are gentle. They were gentle the way large, confident things choose to be. Galloway walked her through the herd without hurrying. He named them not by number but by character, the way a person introduces family members. He paused beside a gray gelding of exceptional size, perhaps 18 hands built across the shoulders, like a structural element of something load-bearing. Goliath. His great-grandsire pulled your grandfather's plow for 15 years. Never missed a day of work in his life. This one has the same quality, not just the strength, but the steadiness. You can trust him in the lead position because he doesn't make decisions based on what he's feeling. He decides based on what the work requires. Further into the herd, he stopped beside a younger gelding with a darker coat and eyes that tracked their approach with visible, active attention. This is Compass. He's a thinker. Put him beside Goliath, and you have the two things a working team needs: one that holds the course, one that understands the terrain. Together, they'll keep the other 10 honest. Vera ran her hand down Compass's neck. The horse leaned into it slightly, not demanding, but accepting the gesture of an animal that has been handled well since birth, by a person who knew the difference between managing an animal's behavior through dominance and building its cooperation through consistency. She asked Galloway the price. He named a figure. The total for 12 animals, Goliath, Compass, 10 others he'd already selected in his mind before she'd arrived, she suspected came to just under $40,000. One-fifth the cost of the Harvester 915. Less than the annual maintenance the loan agreement would have required. She had the money in her father's savings account, the full principal of his life insurance policy, drawn down by nothing because Thomas Whitfield had lived without the medical catastrophes that depleted such reserves. She would not need to borrow a dollar. She would not need to sign a document that adjusted its terms annually in response to federal guidance. She told him she'd take all 12. Galloway nodded once as though this confirmed something he'd been holding as probable rather than certain. He did not celebrate the transaction. He folded the rag he'd been carrying, tucked it into his back pocket, and said they should go over the feeding schedules before she took them home. Getting 12 draft horses from Comanche County to Granger County required 3 trips with a borrowed stock trailer, each trip a half-day's drive. Vera made the runs across 4 days in late April, the Kansas spring still cold enough in the mornings to put mist on the horse's breath when she loaded them in the gray pre-dawn. By the end of the 4th day, all 12 were in the old barn, which smelled for the first time in 20 years, the way a barn was built to smell warm organic, the specific compound of hay and grain dust and large animals that Vera associated not with her own childhood, but with her grandfather's absorbed secondhand through his journal entries and the occasional vivid description that had seemed merely literary until she was standing inside the thing he'd been describing. The barn itself required attention before it was ready for its new purpose. 3 days of work repairing stall boards, replacing water lines, checking the hayloft floor for structural weakness, installing the tie rings her grandfather's journal specified for a 12-horse operation. She did the work herself with her own tools, sourcing lumber from the salvage yard in Granger rather than the building supply where new materials would have cost 3 times more. The investment in the barn renovation totaled less than $800. She tracked every expenditure in a ledger she'd started the morning after reading Eli's journal columns of figures kept in the same format. He'd used the discipline of documentation as a hedge against the memory's tendency to round in whichever direction is convenient. The McCormick Deering binder came out from under its stiffened tarp in early May, dragged into the light where she could work on it properly. The canvases were beyond saving and needed full replacement. She found a harness shop in a town 30 miles east, whose owner was old enough to remember when binder canvas was a standard item. The bull wheel's wooden spokes she replaced one at a time, turning the new ones from white oak on a lathe her grandfather had left in the workshop. The knotter mechanism was the real obstacle. Seized completely packed with rust, it required 3 weeks of incremental work. Careful application of penetrating oil heat from a propane torch, applied in small patient increments, and the kind of attention that the mechanized world had largely decided was no longer an economic use of a person's time. She did not think of it as an economic use of her time. She thought of it as the difference between owning a tool and being owned by the system that serviced it. By the 3rd week of May, the binder was operational. She tested it on a small patch of winter wheat that had come up early on the south-facing slope of the property's lowest field, hitching 4 horses in a configuration her grandfather had specified for initial testing. Watching the machine's mechanisms engage with the standing grain, the canvases moving the knotter, cycling through its complex sequence of operations to tie each bundle of cut wheat into a neat sheaf. When the first properly tied sheaf dropped from the machine onto the stubble behind it, she stopped the team and climbed down from the seat and picked up the bundle and held it with both hands, feeling its weight, the tightness of the twine knot that the century-old knotter had tied as cleanly as it had tied the first one it ever made. The arithmetic of the test convinced her. She ran the numbers that evening by lamplight at the kitchen table. At her current rate with a full 6-horse team instead of 4, the binder could handle her wheat acreage within the harvest window. It would not be efficient by the standards Cresswell-Harman applied to the word. It would be adequate, which was what the situation required. Planting in the first weeks of May drew attention she hadn't sought. The county road ran along the eastern edge of her property for half a mile, close enough that drivers could see the fields, could see the team moving in its steady lines, the dark earth turning behind the plow in furrows that were, she knew from stopping to look at them, straighter than any she'd seen produced by tractor cultivation. Horses worked at a pace that allowed precision. A tractor worked at a pace that required approximation. The difference showed in the furrows, though she doubted most of the people slowing their cars on the county road were looking at the furrows. They were looking at the spectacle, a young woman alone, commanding 6 animals, each of whom outweighed her by 1,400 pounds, moving across a Kansas field in what must have appeared from the road to be an act of theatrical anachronism. She did not perform it for them. She performed it for the wheat, which had no opinion about what century the equipment belonged to. Aldous Dunbar drove past twice without stopping. The second time she caught his truck and her peripheral vision slowed to nearly walking pace on the county road, moving along the fence line parallel to where she was working. She did not look over. She kept her attention on the team and the furrow on Goliath in the lead position, encompassed beside him the 4 horses behind them, pulling in the configuration her grandfather's journal had specified for a 6-horse hitch. When she reached the end of the row, she turned the team with a practiced sequence of rein adjustments and voice commands, a small collection of words the horses responded to with the confidence of a language they'd been born into, and started back on the next line. When she looked toward the road, Dunbar's truck was gone. June arrived with genuine warmth. The wheat was 3 inches tall, even across the field to stand as good as anything she'd put in the ground. Her input costs through the end of May were $41 in grain for the horses, $12 in farrier services for the first of what would be regular hoof maintenance visits, $22 in miscellaneous supplies. She wrote the figures in the ledger. Below them, she wrote what her neighbors were spending. The co-op's fuel pump receipts showed diesel at 38 cents per gallon, and the big machines used diesel at rates that made her arithmetic look like a different category of activity entirely. She was not gloating about this. She was monitoring it the way her grandfather had monitored rainfall and yield per acre, as data, as signal, as the ongoing conversation between a farm operation and its economic environment. The county agent, a man named Prescott, who drove a government green pickup, stopped by in the second week of June on what he described as a routine visit. He walked the near field with her, bending occasionally to push 2 fingers into the soil, reading its texture the way the job required him to read it, saying things about pH and moisture retention that were accurate but not revelatory. He was careful in his language. He did not directly criticize the horses. He used the word unconventional 4 times in 20 minutes, which told her everything she needed to know about his actual assessment. At the edge of the field, he stopped beside a section she'd asked him to look at specifically. The soil there was noticeably different from the corresponding zone in the Dunbar operation, visible across the fence line, darker, more structured, the surface less compacted. She had brought a small spade and she dug down 6 inches to show him the profile. Earthworms. Not the occasional survivor, but a genuine population distributed throughout the upper horizon of the soil, which was looser than it should have been this early in the season if the heavy equipment that had compacted the adjacent fields had been at work here. Prescott looked at the soil profile for a moment. He wrote something in his notebook. He told her it was interesting. He said interesting the way a man says it when the word he actually means would require him to revise something he thought he knew. She covered the hole back up. She thanked him for his time. He drove away on his government business, and she went back to work. It was in the 3rd week of July that Aldous Dunbar came back to the fence line, not in his truck this time, but on foot, walking the property boundary in the evening light, the way a man walks when he's thinking rather than going somewhere. Vera was finishing the last row of a cultivation pass, unhitching the team at the end of the field, moving through the practice sequence of unbuckling coiling, distributing the weight of the leather harness across her arm. She heard him before she saw him, his boots in the dry grass along the fence line. He stood with his forearms on the top rail, looking at the field she'd just worked. He was quiet for a long time, which with Dunbar was normal. When he spoke, what he said was not what she'd expected. "What's your diesel bill for the month?" She told him 0. He looked at the field. He calculated something in the privacy of his own head. She could see it in his face, the internal arithmetic of a farmer running numbers, the particular expression of a practical man doing math that is arriving at an uncomfortable conclusion. He did not share the conclusion. He pushed back from the fence, tucked his thumbs into his belt, and said he'd heard diesel was up again at the co-op. 3 cents in the last 2 weeks. She told him she'd heard that too. He looked at Goliath, who was standing at the end of his lead rope, pulling at a patch of grass with placid concentration. He looked at the field. He looked at the fence line between their properties for a moment, the physical marker of the boundary between two different bets on the future. Then he said that he'd see her around and walk back the way he'd come, his figure diminishing in the long summer evening light. She watched him go. The man who had offered to help her sell the farm was now doing subtraction on his fuel bills and looking at her horses. She did not allow herself the luxury of satisfaction about this. Satisfaction was not useful information, but she noted it the way she noted everything, as signal as data, as part of the ongoing argument the world was making whether or not anyone was listening. The storm arrived on a Saturday night in late September, the kind of storm that the Great Plains produces with the efficiency of long practice building on the western horizon through the afternoon until it occupied the whole sky, then moving in with the wall of rain drama that always impressed her despite being familiar. She was in the barn when it broke, finishing the evening feeding, moving down the stall line with the feed cart in the pattern she'd established over 5 months. Goliath first compass, second the others in the sequence she'd settled on in June, when she'd learned enough about their individual personalities to know who needed to eat in what order to keep the social structure of the herd stable. The storm hit the barn roof with a sound like applause that built into something less polite. The horses shifted in their stalls but did not panic. Galloway had bred for temperament precisely because animals that panicked in storms were useless at the moments when storms made fieldwork impossible. She worked through the feeding routine without hurrying. When she reached Goliath's stall at the far end, she pressed her palm against the vast warmth of his shoulder and looked out through the open top section of the barn door at the Dunbar property visible across the fence line. The floodlights on Dunbar's equipment shed were on. His new combine sat under their white glare with its enormous profile, every line of it expressing the industrial confidence that Cresswell Harmon sold as modernity. Dunbar's farmhouse windows were lit and warm. The television's particular flicker was faintly visible. A man in his comfortable chair, his day's work accomplished by machine in a fraction of the time her work had taken. She leaned her forehead against Goliath's shoulder. The horse exhaled slowly, a sound like the release of something held too long. She was tired in a way that was not simply the end of a long day, but the accumulation of 6 months of long days, a fatigue that had weight and texture that sat in her shoulders and her hands and behind her eyes. She was 24 years old, running an 800-acre farm without a hired hand, working from before first light to after last light on a schedule that did not accommodate illness or injury or the ordinary human need for a day that did not require everything. She was doing the work her grandfather had documented as feasible. She was doing it alone because the people who might have helped had laughed. The doubt was not a thought. It was a physical sensation, a loosening in the chest, the feeling of a structure that has been under load for too long beginning to register the accumulation. Maybe the laughter had been correct. Not about the horses were working, the numbers were right, she knew that. But about her. About whether a 24-year-old woman could sustain this alone, whether the scale was possible without partnership, without a second set of hands that she did not have. She pushed herself away from Goliath's warmth. She walked to the small room at the end of the barn that had been her grandfather's tack room, the one where he'd kept his harness and his tools, where he'd also kept his books. She'd brought a kerosene lamp in there weeks ago for the evening she worked late. She lit it now. On the shelf beside the saddle hooks were three of Eli's journals. She'd brought them from the attic for the nights when the work was done, and she needed company that didn't require explanation. She pulled the 1948 volume from the shelf. She had read it before, but not all the way through, not this particular volume. She opened it to the middle somewhere in summer by the date and began to read. Her grandfather's voice on the page was different in 1948 than in other years. The Dust Bowl was a decade gone, but the memory of it lived in every line, not as sentiment, but as information. The way a person who has survived a particular danger writes about the next danger with a precision that comes from having learned what imprecision costs. He wrote about the farms in the county that had taken on debt after the war, encouraged by good prices and the evangelism of progress, mortgaging themselves to the equipment loan structure that promised efficiency. He wrote about the drought of 1948, which was real but not catastrophic, but which was enough for the heavily leveraged operations to trigger the bank conversations that were more catastrophic than the drought itself. He wrote, the land dried out, but it recovered. The debt did not dry out. It found new channels. She turned pages. She was looking for the passage she half remembered from a previous reading, the one she hadn't fully absorbed because she hadn't yet needed it. She found it in October 1948. Eli had written, last night I nearly went to see about selling the East team. The prices are low and the bills are not. I sat in this room for an hour and thought about it. What I kept returning to was this: I am tired. Tired is real, but tired is not the same as wrong. The arithmetic has not changed because I am tired. The soil has not changed. The horses have not changed. Only my feeling has changed, and a feeling in the middle of a hard night is not a reliable advisor. I went to bed. I got up. The work was the same. The numbers were the same. The horses were the same. This is what it means to have a position rather than a mood. Vera read the paragraph twice. She set the journal down on the harness hook beside the lamp. She sat in the small room with the rain loud on the barn roof while the sentence settled into the place where the doubt had been. Tired is real. But tired is not the same as wrong. She blew out the lamp. She walked back through the barn, checked the stall latches by feel in the darkness, listened to 12 horses breathe in the particular rhythm of animals at rest. Then she went to the farmhouse through the rain. On the 6th day of October, a Monday, she was cultivating the south field in the early morning when the radio in the truck, she kept it running during field work for the weather reports, carried a bulletin about military activity along the Suez Canal. She knew the geography from schooling, knew the political context in the way that a person who reads newspapers knows context without tracking it professionally. She listened to the report through 2 passes of the field, the team moving in their steady rhythm below her, while the broadcast described Egyptian forces crossing into Israeli-held territory. Israeli forces mobilizing the language of the report grave in the particular way of radio voices that have been trained to convey that something significant is occurring without conveying panic. She stopped the team at the end of the 3rd row. She sat on the binder's seat in the October morning, the horses standing patiently in their traces, the engine of the truck radio carrying its news across the stubble field to where she sat thinking. Her grandfather had written in 1949 about the relationship between American agricultural economics and foreign petroleum supply, not as prediction, but as observation. The kind of structural analysis that a man who paid close attention to where things came from made naturally. He had written, the new tractors run on oil that comes from the ground of other nations. What happens to other nations' ground is therefore a farm matter, whether farmers think of it that way or not. She had read that passage in March, the morning she opened the journal. She had thought about it at Harmon's dealership, looking at the Harvester 915, and its implicit requirement that the supply lines from distant places remain uninterrupted. She was thinking about it now in a Kansas field in October, listening to a radio report about a war beginning in a region that produced a significant percentage of the petroleum that ran the machines that grew the food that fed the country. She did not know what would happen. Nobody knew yet. The war had started 6 hours ago. But she understood the architecture of the situation in a way that her grandfather's 30 years of careful observation had given her, and the architecture suggested a direction even if it did not specify a destination. She clicked to the team the particular two-syllable sound that meant resume, and Goliath moved forward, and Compass moved with him, and the other 10 horses moved as one long-breathing engine, and the binder began its work again. She would push the harvest forward. She would not tell anyone why. She would not explain it because explanation required a certainty she didn't have, and because the arithmetic spoke for itself to anyone willing to sit with it, which in Granger County in October of 1973 appeared to be a population of approximately 1. She worked until the light ran out. The field was half done. She watered the horses, fed them, checked their feet. For stones, ran her hands down their legs, checking for heat or swelling the daily maintenance ritual that was also the daily confirmation that her power source was healthy. Goliath leaned into her hand when she reached his shoulder. Compass watched her from across the stall with that alert, intelligent attention that made her think of her grandfather's description, a thinker. She went to the farmhouse. She wrote the day's numbers in the ledger. She wrote the date of the radio report in the margin, October 6, 1973. She drew a line under it. Below the line, she wrote nothing. She left the space empty. She would know what to write there when the time came. The 17th of October arrived the way consequential days often do, without ceremony, without the atmospheric drama that memory later assigns to them. It was a Tuesday. The sky over Granger County was the particular flat blue of a Kansas autumn morning that has burned off its early haze, the air carrying the first genuine cold of the season. The kind that reminds the body winter is not a theory. Vera was in the south field before sunrise, hitching the team by lantern light. Her breath visible in the cold, the horse's breath visible too. 12 small clouds rising from 12 large bodies with the patient regularity of engines at idle. She had the radio in the truck cab tuned to the Wichita station. The broadcast at 6 o'clock carried the news that the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries had announced an embargo on oil shipments to the United States effective immediately. The announcer's voice carried the careful gravity of someone reading a bulletin whose full implications have not yet been calculated. The embargo was a response to American military support for Israel during the war that had begun 11 days earlier. The supply disruption, the announcer said, was expected to be significant. Vera listened to the report through 2 complete cycles of the broadcast, the team standing in their traces, Goliath motionless in the lead position, with the stillness of an animal that has learned that waiting is part of the work. She had left space in the ledger margin. Now she knew what to write there. She clicked to the team. The morning's work began. The news moved through Granger County with a speed that rural communities reserve for information that touches the operational core of daily life. By mid-morning, the fuel desk at the Farmers Co-op had posted a limit 10 gallons per vehicle per visit. By noon, that limit had been reduced to 5. By 3 in the afternoon, the diesel pump had a hand-lettered sign on it that read, "Closed supply pending." And the men who had gathered around the co-op's parking lot were having the conversation that men have when a thing they have treated as permanent reveals itself to be contingent. Vera drove through Granger that afternoon on her way to the hardware store for a replacement part for the binder's canvases. She did not stop at the co-op. She had no reason to. Her truck ran on gasoline, not diesel, and her farm ran on oats. She grew herself water from a well with a hand pump backup, the accumulated physical capital of 12 animals, whose fuel chain began in her own soil. She drove through the town without stopping and watched the men in the co-op lot through her windshield without slowing, the way you watch weather from inside a house, with attention without involvement. What she saw in their faces was the particular expression of people confronting the gap between what they had assumed was permanent and what the morning's news had revealed was fragile. They were not panicking. Not yet. They were in the first stage, the stage where the mind acknowledges the new information intellectually, while the body continues to assume the old conditions. The panic would come later, when the first payment was due on a machine that couldn't run. She bought her canvas parts. She drove home. She unhitched the team at the end of the day's work as the sun went flat on the western horizon, running through the feeding routine with a methodical attention that 6 months of practice had made automatic. The horses ate. The barn settled into its evening sounds. She went to the farmhouse, lit the kitchen lamp, opened the ledger, wrote the day's numbers. Below the fuel cost column, which read, as it had read every day of the growing season, zero, she wrote, OPEC embargo announced. October 17th, 1973. She drew a box around the date. It was the only editorial mark she'd ever made in the ledger. Her grandfather had made similar marks in his journals boxes around dates that turned out to matter, the visual notation of a man who trusted that significance, once recognized, deserved to be named. The first week after the embargo produced a county-wide recalibration that moved in visible stages. The farms that had fuel reserves stored diesel in their own tanks, purchased before the crisis at pre-embargo prices, continued to operate. Their operators moved with the slightly accelerated energy of people who know their margin is finite. The farms without reserves, or with reserves insufficient to complete the harvest, began to show the particular stillness of large equipment at rest in fields that required attention. Aldous Dunbar had reserves. He was a methodical man who maintained a 6-week fuel supply as a matter of operational practice, a habit left over from his father's era. He continued harvesting through the first week. Vera could hear his machine operating in the evenings, the distant mechanical sound carrying across the flatland, the specific rhythm of a combine moving through standing wheat. She did not resent the sound. He had made a bet as she had made a bet, and his bet had not yet fully resolved against him. He was still in the field. By the second week, his machine was quiet. She learned later through the ordinary social information channels of a small county that his reserves had run out, that he'd attempted to source diesel through a broker in Wichita, that the broker's price was 3 times the pre-embargo rate and falling short of sufficient supply. He had approximately 200 acres of wheat still standing when his tanks went dry. 200 acres of standing wheat in October in Kansas with no harvest equipment that could operate without fuel was not an agricultural problem. It was a financial catastrophe presented in agricultural terms. The loan on his combine was due in 30-day cycles. The combine was sitting in the field. The wheat was standing in the wind, the heads nodding, the grain slowly approaching the overripe threshold beyond which the shattering losses would begin, the grain falling from the head before it could be harvested each day of delay, a subtraction from the final yield that the loan payment did not care about. Vera was in her north field on a Wednesday morning when she heard boots on the dry grass behind her. She halted the team with a soft word turned on the binder seat. Dunbar was coming across the stubble toward her from the direction of the fence line, walking with the deliberate pace of a man who has been thinking about this walk for several days. He was not wearing his hat, which she had never seen before. He carried it in his right hand, turning the brim slowly with his fingers. The nervous rotation of a prop held by a man who needs something to do with his hands when the rest of him is required to be still. He stopped 10 feet from the team. Goliath regarded him without alarm. Compass tracked him with that alert, focused attention. Dunbar looked at the horses for a moment. Then he looked at her. His face had the quality of a man who has mentally rehearsed a conversation many times and has now arrived at the moment when the rehearsal ends. I have 200 acres standing in the east section. I can't get diesel. He stopped as though the sentence required a moment of space around it before anything else could be added. I know what I'm asking. I know what I said in March. But I'm asking. She studied him. She was not calculating whether to help. She had already made that decision, had made it in the abstract weeks ago, when she understood that the embargo, when it came, would fall hardest on the people least able to absorb it. She was waiting to hear whether he understood the terms of what he was asking, whether this was a request between neighbors or a transaction between people who had, both in their different ways, made serious decisions about serious stakes. I'll bring the team over tomorrow morning, she told him. We work together, you handle the shocking while I run the binder. When we're done with your section, you work mine through spring. Labor for labor. She watched his face. That's the trade. Dunbar's jaw tightened slightly, not with resistance, but with the effort of receiving help without the subordination that charity requires. What she'd offered him was not charity. It was exchange. It was the agricultural economy. Her grandfather's journals described the one that predated the debt and fuel structure that had become the only model most farmers in Granger County could imagine. He understood that distinction. It was visible in the way the tightness in his jaw resolved. Labor for labor, he repeated. Fair enough? She turned back to the team. The binder resumed its work. Behind her, she heard Dunbar walking back toward the fence line, his boots in the dry stubble. They spent 4 days on Dunbar's standing wheat. She brought Goliath compass, 4 others from the herd, the binder, sufficient canvas replacement. Dunbar worked alongside her without complaint, without the particular friction that can develop between two people when one is helping the other and neither is comfortable with the arrangement. He worked hard, which she respected, the way she respected any person who put their full physical attention into a task without requiring acknowledgement for it. By the fourth afternoon, the last of his standing wheat was in shocks drying in the October air salvageable. On the last day, as she was unhitching the team at the end of the final row, Dunbar came and stood beside her without speaking for a moment. He took one end of the harness she was coiling, holding it, while she worked the other end, the practical assistance of someone who has been around horses enough to know how to be useful. When the harness was coiled, he said without looking at her, "Ruth wants to know if you'd come to dinner Sunday." Vera accepted. It was the first social invitation she'd received in 7 months that did not carry the undertone of pity. Cresswell Harmon came on a Thursday in the third week of October. She did not hear his vehicle. She was working the Northfield's final section, the team in their afternoon rhythm, the binder cycling through the last of the standing wheat on that half of the property, the sheaves dropping behind her in the pale autumn light. She looked up at the end of her row, and he was there standing at the fence line in a coat that belonged to a life spent mostly indoors. He had no clipboard, no photographs, no loan documents. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets, his large frame somehow diminished by the context of the field, the way a man who is impressive in rooms can seem reduced by open space. She brought the team to a halt at the end of the row 20 yards from where he stood. She sat on the binder seat and looked at him across the distance. He did not move closer to the fence. He stood where he was, looking at the horses, looking at the machine, looking at the wheat sheaves lying in their rows across the field behind her, the visible evidence of a harvest that was happening while most of the county's harvest equipment sat idle. His expression was not the face of a salesman calculating a new approach. It was the face of a man standing in the presence of evidence he had been certain would not exist, trying to reorganize his understanding around a fact he had laughed at in March. He stood there long enough that she began to wonder if he would speak at all. Then, "How did you know?" His voice was stripped of the professional warmth it carried in the showroom. What was underneath was quieter, more honest, the voice of a person asking a real question rather than managing a conversation. Vera wrapped the reins around the binder's seat post. She looked at him across the fence line and felt the weight of everything she could have said, the months of pre-dawn mornings, the mechanics laughing in the service bay doorway, the county's confident pity delivered in the register of concern. She could have said all of it. It was true, every piece of it, true in the way that precise documentation is true. She said none of it. "I didn't predict the embargo. I didn't know what was coming or when." She let that sit for a moment. "I just refused to build a life that needed cheap oil from somewhere else to survive. My grandfather understood what a supply chain is. He wrote it down for 30 years so someone would have the information when it mattered." Harmon looked at the horses. He looked at the field. He looked at the fence line between them, the boundary between two different models of what farming was supposed to be, between the version he had sold for 15 years and the version she had spent 7 months proving still worked. "Horses," he said, barely above the volume of the wind. "All this time." He stood there a moment longer. Then he turned and walked back to his vehicle without another word, the sound of his engine starting, the crunch of gravel under tires as he pulled back onto the county road. She watched him go. She did not feel vindicated in the way that vindication is supposed to feel, the clean, satisfying resolution of a proved point. What she felt was more complicated, the specific weight of being right about something that the people around you paid for. The county's harvest losses were real. The loan payments on idle machines were real. Dunbar's 4 days of salvage work and the worry in his face when he'd come across the stubble toward her were real. Being right had not prevented any of that. It had only prevented it from happening to her. She unwrapped the reins. The team moved forward. The binder resumed its work. 3 weeks later, she had a message through the county extension office that Harmon had contacted them inquiring about suppliers of horse-drawn equipment parts, specifically binder canvases, collar pads, hitch hardware. The extension agent who delivered the message was a younger man than Prescott, new to the county without the established convictions about what farming should look like. He mentioned it with the careful neutrality of someone passing information without editorializing. Vera thanked him. She gave him Ernest Galloway's address, the rural route number, on the piece of paper she'd kept in her shirt pocket since March, and told him to pass it on. The information was more valuable than any apology Harmon might have offered. It meant he was responding to the market rather than to his pride, which was the more durable form of change in a practical man. The full harvest came in by the first week of November. Every acre, every bushel of wheat the fields had produced brought in by a team of 12 horses and a century-old binder that had required 3 weeks of patient repair to make functional. The final yield was not record-breaking. It was competent, solid, exactly what a well-managed 800-acre property in a decent rainfall year should produce. She took the grain to the Granger elevator on 3 successive days, the old truck making the 12-mile run with the bed loaded to its rated capacity each time, and deposited the proceeds into the account at Granger County Savings Bank that her father had maintained and she had not touched since the spring. The net for the growing season revenue, minus all input costs, was the cleanest set of numbers she had ever written in the ledger. Her input costs for the entire year totaled less than what Dunbar had spent on diesel in the 2 months before the embargo. Her debt service was zero. Her net margin as a percentage of gross revenue was a figure that would have seemed implausible to anyone operating under the conventional structure of the county's agricultural economy. She wrote the final numbers in the ledger on a Sunday evening in November, the kitchen warm, against the first genuine cold of the winter outside. She wrote them carefully in the column format her grandfather had established, the same format she'd been using since March. When she closed the ledger, she put it on the shelf beside Eli's journals, the new volume beside the old ones, a continuation of the same record, rather than a different kind of document. She sat at the kitchen table for a while in the quiet. The barn was settled for the night, the horses in from the cold, the last of the season's work done. She was 24 years old. She had brought in 800 acres of wheat without a dollar of debt, without a gallon of diesel, without a service contract from a manufacturer's certified technician. She had done it with 12 horses, a repaired machine, her grandfather's 30 years of observation, her own 2 hands. She was also alone in a farmhouse at the end of November, with the nearest neighbor half a mile away, and the question of what the next decade looked like, the decades after this one, the life that would eventually be built from this foundation, was a question the ledger did not answer. The ledger answered the economic question. The human question was larger than the ledger. She did not let herself sit in that largeness too long. It was real, but it was not actionable tonight. Tonight the numbers were right. That was enough. In the spring of 1974, 3 young men from the eastern part of the county came to the farm on a Saturday morning and asked if they could watch her hitch the team. They were in their early 20s, recently returned from military service, looking at the prospect of farming their family land with the specific anxiety of people who understand that the economic model they've returned to is more fragile than it appeared when they left. She put them to work instead of letting them watch. By noon, all 3 had handled the reins under supervision, had learned the voice commands, had felt in their hands the difference between steering a machine with a wheel and communicating with an animal that was choosing to cooperate. 2 of them came back the following Saturday. One of them, a young man named Thomas Aldrich, with his grandfather's mechanical aptitude and a patience that impressed her, became a regular presence on the farm through the growing season, learning harness repair cultivation patterns, the specific discipline of managing a 6-horse hitch across a full working day. She paid him when she could. She taught him when she couldn't. He seemed to understand that the second form of payment was worth more. Through the summer of 1974, the county changed in the ways that counties change when the model they've been operating under shows its structural limits. Some operations consolidated smaller farms, absorbed by larger ones that could sustain the debt load. Some farms went back to the bank in the straightforward transaction of foreclosure, the paperwork that converted a family's history into a creditor's asset. The farmers who had overextended in 1972 and 1973, encouraged by high grain prices and the confident projections of dealers like Cresswell Harmon, found themselves navigating the specific cruelty of owing more on equipment than the equipment could earn at any price diesel could reach. Harmon himself made adjustments. The dealership's back room where the mechanics had laughed in March of 1973 began carrying a line of horse-drawn equipment used sourced from farms that had converted away from it over the preceding 2 decades, reconditioned to operational condition. It was a small line almost apologetic in its placement behind the gleaming mechanical inventory. But it was there. It was there because the market had asked for it, which was the only language Cresswell Harmon had ever been completely fluent in. She heard about the change from Thomas Aldrich, who had heard it at the co-op. She received the news without comment. The Agricultural College at Manhattan sent a letter in the autumn of 1974. Not an inquiry, but an invitation formal signed by the department chair of the Agricultural Economics program. They had been tracking the Whitfield operation's financial performance through the county extension records, and through a paper the young county agent had apparently written about soil health indicators on non-mechanized operations. They wanted her to speak to the students in the fall semester. They wanted her to bring, if she was willing, one of the horses. She brought Compass. The choice was obvious. Of the 12, Compass was the one whose intelligence expressed itself most clearly in a new environment. He was alert without anxiety, curious without distraction, present in a way that communicated itself to people who had never been near a draft horse. She loaded him in the trailer, drove the 3 hours to Manhattan, and led him through the service entrance of the Agricultural Sciences building while the students gathered in the lecture hall. She walked onto the stage with Compass beside her. The size of a Clydesdale in an interior space is a different experience than the size of a Clydesdale in a field. The lecture hall went quiet with the particular quality of quiet that happens when a room of people encounters something their bodies recognize as significant before their minds have finished processing it. Compass stood without concern, his white feathered feet on the stage floor, his large dark eyes moving across the tiered rows of faces with patient attention. She did not lecture them about the past. She gave them the numbers. She put the ledger figures from the 1973 growing season on the chalkboard in the department chair's careful hand. The input cost beside the revenue, the margin calculation, the comparison structure she had built from her grandfather's records. She let the numbers do what numbers do when they are honest and legible. She let them arrive. Then she talked about supply chains, about what it meant economically to power an operation from what the operation itself produced versus what must be imported from places whose stability could not be controlled or predicted. Her grandfather's language translated into the vocabulary of an economics classroom. The concept was not sentimental. It was structural. It was the kind of structural observation that becomes obvious in retrospect and looks like genius in anticipation only because so few people do the work of thinking through the full architecture of the systems they depend on. She was 25 years old, standing on a university stage beside a horse, explaining to a room full of students what her grandfather had written in a Kansas attic over 30 years of quiet observation. The department chair told her afterward that the lecture had prompted more discussion than anything they'd scheduled in the previous 2 years. She thanked him. She loaded Compass back into the trailer. She drove home. The decades that followed the autumn of 1973 wrote themselves in the ledger the way her grandfather's years had written themselves in his journals, season by season, yield by yield, the patient accumulation of a life that had chosen its terms carefully at the beginning and was now living inside those terms. The oil embargoes of the 1970s became the price spikes of the 1980s, became the market volatility of the 1990s, became the fuel costs and debt loads that continued to define the economics of American agriculture in ways that remained structurally unchanged from what her grandfather had identified in the years after the Second World War. The treadmill kept moving. The speed kept increasing. The Whitfield farm kept its pace. She expanded the herd as the decades moved, breeding carefully, maintaining the qualities Galloway had selected for strength, temperament, intelligence, the willingness to work. The land responded to the treatment it received. The soil that had tested well in 1973 tested better in 1983, better still in 1993. Earthworm populations, organic matter content, water retention, the slow metrics of soil health that mechanized agriculture traded away for short-term efficiency returned incrementally, each growing season building the kind of fertility that doesn't appear in a single year's numbers, but shows in the long arc of yield stability, the farm that keeps producing at consistent levels when its neighbors are watching their yields decline as their depleted topsoil reaches the limits of what chemical inputs can compensate for. She never bought a combine. She updated her equipment over the years, newer binders, better harness hardware, improved tools that were still horse-drawn, still powered from within the farm's own production. The core of the operation remained what it had been since April of 1973. 12 animals converting the farm's own land into the work the farm required. Aldous Dunbar converted a portion of his operation to horse cultivation in 1976 after the second significant fuel price event of the decade. He kept his mechanical equipment for the portions of the farm where the economics still favored it. He became over the years a practitioner of a mixed approach that was neither her grandfather's model nor Harmon's something he'd worked out from his own experience and his own arithmetic. She respected that. He was doing his own calculation rather than adopting someone else's conclusion, which was all her grandfather had ever argued for. Thomas Aldrich built his own horse operation on his family's 400 acres in the eastern part of the county. He came back to the Whitfield farm most winters for a week working on harness repair, talking through cultivation questions, the ongoing conversation of people who are practicing the same craft in adjacent contexts. He brought his own sons, eventually two boys who grew up thinking of draft horses as a natural part of what farming looked like. Cresswell Harmon retired in 1981. His son took over the dealership, ran it through the 1980s, eventually sold it to a regional chain. The horse equipment line that Harmon Sr. had added in 1973 had been dropped by 1978 when diesel prices stabilized enough that the market for it contracted back to specialty use. The market gave with one hand, took with the other. The Whitfield farm did not notice either movement. She grew old in the way that people grow old when they have spent their lives doing physical work outdoors in a place with strong seasons, the skin marked by sun, the hands strong longer than the hands of people who have not used them daily, the face lined in patterns that corresponded to specific weathers and specific concentrations, rather than to the diffuse passage of time. She was not sentimental about it. Her grandfather had grown old the same way, and his journals in the later years had the same quality that she recognized in herself. Less the record of someone tracking events, and more the record of someone whose understanding of the place they inhabited had become deep enough that the surface events were less important than the patterns beneath them. She passed the farm to her granddaughter on a September morning when the girl was 22, 2 years younger than Vera had been when she'd stood at Harmon's showroom. The girl was named Eloise for her grandmother's mother, and she had her great-great-grandfather Eli's quality of paying attention to things that other people glossed over, noticing the detail beneath the surface event. She had grown up on the farm, had worked it through her adolescence, understood the horses with the body knowledge that comes from years of daily contact rather than instruction. Vera gave her the journals. All of them, Eli's 30 years, her own 40 years. The complete documentation of what the Whitfield farm had learned about the relationship between independence and survival. She set the stack on the kitchen table the way the county attorney had set the manila folder on the same table 40 years earlier. Eloise looked at the journals, looked at her grandmother, and did not say anything immediately. She understood, as young people do when they are paying attention, that the silence was part of what was being given. They walked the farm together that morning, the September light on the fields, with the particular quality of late-season Kansas light that seems to illuminate from inside the grain heads rather than from above. The current team descendants of Goliath, descendants of Compass animals, who carried in their breeding the choices Ernest Galloway had made across 50 years of careful work, moved in the near pasture with the unhurried ease of animals who belong completely to the place they occupy. Eloise had questions. She always had questions. She asked about the soil test results from the east section, about the harness replacement schedule, about the arrangement with Thomas Aldrich's sons for the spring field work. They were operational questions, practical and specific, the questions of someone thinking about how to run something rather than whether to run it. The whether had been settled. The how was the ongoing conversation. At the edge of the south field, the field where Vera had been working, when Harmon came to the fence line in October of 1973, Eloise stopped. She looked at the land, at the way the soil showed its quality. Even from a standing position, the dark, structured surface of ground that had been treated consistently well for 40 years. She looked at the fence line still standing the boundary that had once marked the edge of two different bets on the future. Was it worth it? She asked. Not challenging, genuinely curious the way a young person asks a real question rather than a rhetorical one. All of it. Was it worth it? Vera considered the question the way it deserved to be considered, without rushing to the answer that would sound good rather than the one that was true. She thought about the mornings in the dark, the weight of the doubt she'd carried in the barn during the September storm of 1973, the years of physical work that had no day off, the human loneliness of a choice that most of the county had considered ridiculous for longer than she cared to specify. She thought about the ledger numbers, the soil tests, the farm's clean title passing through two generations. She thought about Aldous Dunbar on the last day of the salvage harvest, taking the end of the harness she was coiling, holding it while she worked. She thought about her grandfather writing a letter in 1951 to a granddaughter he would never know, trusting that the letter would find its way to the right hands at the right moment. The confidence required for that act, the confidence that the thing you understood was true enough, lasting enough to be worth the effort of recording for someone who did not yet exist, was a different kind of confidence than the confidence Harmon had sold. It was not the confidence of a machine promising efficiency. It was the confidence of a principle that has been tested against reality for long enough that the testing is its own evidence. The land is better than when I started, Vera said finally. The books are clean. You'll inherit something that belongs to you. She looked at the field, at the fence line, at the pale blue September sky that arched over the same ground her grandfather had written about in the same month 70 years before. Whether it was worth it isn't a question the farm can answer. The farm just keeps the record. What you do with the record is the only answer that matters. Eloise stood beside her in the morning light, the journals under her arm, looking at what 40 years of a particular kind of attention had built. She was 22 years old. The fields were in good condition. The horses were healthy. The debt was zero. She had everything she needed to begin. The voice of an older Vera, looking back across the distance of decades, carried the equanimity of someone who has lived long enough inside their choices to know them completely, to know their costs alongside their returns, to have made peace with both. They called it nostalgia. My grandfather called it sovereignty. I called it the only math that ever made sense, the arithmetic of a life that does not owe its survival to something it cannot control. The farm remembered. The land held the record. The horses moved in the morning light the way they had always moved, with the steady, unhurried power of things that know their work. The wheat was in the ground. The books were clean. The journals were in the right hands. The rest was the ongoing conversation between a piece of land and the people willing to listen to what it was saying.